Hello, my friends. Thank you for taking a few minutes to join me on this episode of The Reluctant Watchman. I'm super excited to dive in to the topic today, which it's an extension of a video that I recently did on Hermeticism, or the Principles, 7 Hermetic Laws. And today we're touching on mentalism. It is such a fascinating topic. So let's dive in. The universe itself is mental. Therefore, all intelligence may access this universal mind to gain any and all understanding. And that's a very important thing, is to understand that we do have access to the mind and will of God. And it takes a lot of effort to do that. And I believe there are realms and dimensions of how all of that plays out for our own good. And there are things that shield us that we'll get into towards the end of this video. But I think it's important to first take a look at this idea of how important is it that we have a belief in a life after death. Because if you don't believe that your intelligence, that who you are, we'll call it your spirit, continues on, then your thought is gone. So it's incredibly important to understand or at least have a belief in and a knowledge of, or at least a desire, we'll just say even just a desire to know, does the spirit continue on, and what are the ramifications of that? And so I've got some notes here to help me continue, or to keep my thoughts a little bit more organized. The understanding or belief that we continue on after death is very important. Upon death, we shed our physical body, or this robe of flesh, and our spirit continues. The spirit retains its identity, personality, memories, and moral qualities. Our consciousness is eternal and indestructible. And I think that's really important to note. Identity, personality, memories, moral qualities, and probably 1,000 other things that go with us. But the one thing that you will not be taking with you are your material possessions from this planet. And I think that is such an important point to bring up, because we tend to be, as a society, extremely materialistic. We love things. And I think it's important that we begin to migrate away from that and the dependency on it, or at least attaching our happiness and the happiness of others to material possessions. And I know there's some basic qualities of life that need to be met that do help with that. But even with that, we can still come to an understanding that when we have very little to nothing, our personal worth and our value and even our joy is based upon our spiritual spirit, our soul, our minds, and not necessarily the physical world around us. And there's a balance, right? Because we're still in this world at this moment. But in reality, your higher self is so much more grand and beautiful than the body. As I mentioned, this robe of flesh, right? If you want to go study the Ascension of Isaiah, the apocryphal writing, the Ascension of Isaiah, fascinating insight about the robes of the flesh. But it's just important to understand that you are not going to take any of that with you. The material possessions of this life will not go. And I've been studying a little bit some words of Buddha that we're going to get into, and he focuses a little bit on this importance of the power of the mind. And in some discussion that I was listening to, he mentions this idea that literally nothing goes with us. And he lived a life of really a simplification of what it meant to be a human being and to be a spirit, and the freedom that brought him as an individual. All right, to help explore this idea a little bit more about why it's important to have this belief in identity and how that can help us at least in that belief, when we go beyond the veil, you may be familiar with a French philosopher by the name of René Descartes. And he came up with the famous phrase, "I think, therefore I am." And what he was trying to do, he says, "At last I have discovered it, thought. This is the one thing that can't be separated from me. I am, I exist, that is certain." So the simple act of thinking, I believe, proves that we not only exist, but that we continue on. A couple of the things that he was trying to prove with that, he was trying to prove there is at least one certain truth that cannot be doubted, that is thought. The self, or the mind, exists independently of the physical world, essentially our spirits, and that knowledge can be built on clear and undeniable foundations, starting with a thinking mind. And that's really important. And that's why in my last video, I talked about the foundation that is thought, or mentalism, because we can take all of the other principles, universal laws, and use them and modify them and tweak them, but it all begins with a thought and an intention. So we're going to get into this a little bit, but it really comes from the heart and from the mind. It's this beautiful synchronicity that we bring between the heart and the mind. Now let's try a little bit of a thought experiment. Do you have any memory of the past? Like if you were to sit here and think, what did I do when I woke up this morning? What did I have for breakfast? What did I do a week ago? What did I do when I was in, some high school or college class or grade school or whatever? Do you have any prior memory? Well, if you do, let's take this to what we would consider to be a logical end. If you believe that memory or thought is simply the process of synapses and neurons in the brain creating this little database in our heads that's just staying there, or maybe it's logged in the body somewhere, upon the ceasing to function of those neurological synapses, right, those little bursts of thought, when that body dies and that process ends, would you be able to even remember anything that happened prior to that? I know this is a little, in fact, I wrote some notes down here about this. It says, if consciousness is solely confined to neural activity in the body, all of it would cease to exist when the body dies. If consciousness does not exist beyond the threshold of death, all awareness of the past would cease to exist. The fact that you can retain any memory proves that the spirit is eternal in nature. So hopefully that clarifies that a little bit. When you die, the fact that if nothing existed beyond that means that you would not be able to remember what is currently happening today. So the fact that you can remember is such a beautiful thing. It's simple, but it's also beautiful. And I believe that it shows that we do continue on because we have the capacity to remember. And I think it's a really important part of who we are in our learning process is to remember, because that is us gaining these experiences and moral concepts and ideas. That is our progression. And remembering is very important, or at least the ability to remember and to log memories. Okay, the second point we're going to touch on is the limitless capacity of the mind. We have access to the universal mind, or the mind of the creator. So how do we access this universal mind? And I believe that each and every one of us is very unique and individual. And I've told this to my kids lately. I said, do you know that you're a snowflake? And I don't mean it in the more modern term of someone who melts at the first hint of opposition. No. Snowflakes are all individual and unique, and your fingerprint, your spirit is very unique. And so the process by which God speaks to you is very individual and very unique. And so first, I would say, understand who you are intrinsically and work and begin with that. Understand your thoughts and who you are, and your value is independent of the material world that you are in right now, that you are an eternal being. I really enjoy what was taught in the end of the Book of Mormon, in Moroni 10:5. It mentions that we can know the truth of all things by the power of the Holy Ghost. That power of the Holy Ghost, however we want to define that, is the mind and will of God. We can come to know the truth of all things by tapping into that source of all things, which is our Creator. We can come to know the truth of all of that. And in this life, each of us has our contracts that we've signed about kind of what we're getting out of this life. But I do believe that at some point in time, all of that knowledge and understanding, however far that's going to take us, whatever we consider perfection, we will get to that space where we're able to tap into that resource and understand what that means, to be able to have access to the universal mind. And I think in the beginning, what's so important about this tapping into the universal mind is beautifully displayed in the Book of Mormon in Alma 32. I've mentioned this before, but Alma gives this parable about a seed. And he says, take this desire and plant it in your heart. We can take those principles that we're learning and plant them and then begin to see the fruits, and they will grow and they will grow and they will grow. And for a lot of people, they need, for example, they need the baby trainers, or they need those basic foundations maybe of churches and religions, but eventually the individual needs to come into their own power and autonomy to know their self-worth and value before God, which is beautiful and amazing. And so this process of learning and spiritually growing from an individual standpoint, it will continue on through the eternities as we've, depending on how we want to define time and how all of that works independent of this realm. But just know that our thoughts are those seeds that we're planting at the very beginning. And they're incredibly important to begin that process of planting those seeds and seeing that process grow over time. A parallel idea to this idea of planting a seed was introduced to me by somebody that was helping me with something on my property a while back, and they said, in the process of creating this thing, you get to create it spiritually first. And I thought that's as a beautiful way to think about this process of mentalism, is it truly is spiritual creation. And this can go a lot of different directions. It can be a very positive experience, or we can also create negatively. And so think about the next time that you are concepting an idea, or you're thinking about future plans, goals, you're mulling over a concept in your head. Understand that you get to create those things in your mind. And spiritual creation is a beautiful place to be able to play, because guess what? No one can tell you no. It is an unlimited field of where you can create spiritually. You get to be able to play in that space. So maybe just flag that term in the back of your head, spiritual creation, and just how important it is for you to be able to play in that space. In the process of talking about mentalism, I mentioned in my first essay that this truly is one of the first principles, because it allows you to be able to manipulate or to use all of the other types of laws for your own benefit. It talks about vibration, correspondence, and so on. So continuing with this idea of spiritual creation, I wrote a note here about, just encapsulates this idea. It says, external actions are sometimes limited by circumstances, but thoughts and intentions are where choice is clearest and present unlimited freedom, either to our benefit or our demise. So just keep in mind that our thoughts really do precede our actions. There's literally nothing that you can do in this life until you think about it first. Now, sometimes that process between action and thought happen very quickly, for example, in an emergency, but thought precedes action in all things. And really, that thought, your thinking, shapes your reality. I know that I've mentioned this phrase before: thought leads to actions, actions lead to habit, habits lead to character, or define your character, and your character becomes your destiny. So really, in the beginning, there's that spark of divinity, which is implanted in all of God's children. It's the capacity to think or to create original thought. Something to keep in mind: this is not a new concept in this realm of either philosophy or scripture. A lot of people might be familiar with Proverbs 23:7. This is from, it's in the book of Proverbs, and it says, "For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he." And this was the inspiration for the book As a Man Thinketh by James Allen. If you want to go check out that book, wonderful book. Some other things about how our thoughts shape our reality is, think about maybe the power of mental projection, the benefit of that, or having just an internal dialogue, the ability to think through ideas and concepts in the mental state before they come out. These can be things like role-playing in your mind, forethought, all of those types of things. Now, another thing that talks about this idea of the limitless capacity of the mind and how important this is. Years ago, I read the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, incredibly important work. And I thought it was fascinating. He said that of the one last great freedom that all humans have is the ability to choose one's attitude and their response in any given situation. And this is even when everything has been taken away from us. And so regardless of what happens to you in your life, the one great gift that you have is how you respond to the world around you. And that happens in your thoughts. It's an amazing principle. People don't make you angry. You choose to be angry. And I know that can be really difficult in trying to understand, to say, no, that person made me angry. But in reality, no. We have been given all of the power that we need, the individual, I say autonomy a lot, but it's the individual gift to make the decision as to how we respond to the world around us. All right, now I talked about circumstances a little bit, and can the circumstances that we put ourselves in influence our thoughts? And I believe that they can. So it's not just a matter of thinking, but putting ourselves in the right place and the right frame of mind. And so, for example, if you put yourself, if every morning you choose to wake up and you pick up your phone, and the first thing that you do is you flip open the news, or you pick up your social media feed, or whatever social platform that you're on, what do you think that's going to start to do as far as manipulating your thoughts? Right? Think about that, just how important it is that you gain control of your thoughts. I'm reminded of a paper that I read from a gentleman on meditation, and there was a stat in there that I don't know how true it was, but it sounds quite relevant here. He said that the majority of people act out of habit a high percentage of the time. It was something like 95% of the time we are not thinking and acting upon those thoughts. We are literally just acting upon the world around us based upon what someone either tells us to do. And we have a very small fraction of time, 5% or so, where we actually have original thought and we act upon those thoughts. And I think it's important for us to increase this significantly. Now, we could say, well, what about, for example, the wealthy mindset? The wealthy people have more free time to be able to think, or what, maybe somebody who's in a poverty mindset. Well, or a state of poverty. And I think what we need to do is, instead of focusing necessarily on the freedoms that it gives us in wealth or poverty, as we focus on this flow state of understanding good intention, either if we're wealthy, because somebody who's wealthy could be incredibly unhappy, and somebody who is in a state of poverty could also be very unhappy as well. But if we understand our intentions of how we approach this, our mind, and the intentions that we approach any state, our material world that we're in, that flow state of having good intention will be a blessing to us. And so just understand that it's really important that instead of becoming a creature of the circumstances around us, that we create the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And that begins with our thoughts. And whether we allow the world around us to influence those, or if we take control of those and we become the driver, right? We get in the driver's seat and we are the ones who create. The third part that I'd like to focus on comes from the writings and the work of Allan Kardec. And it is about the accountability of our thoughts. And this is an incredibly important aspect. And I'm still thinking through these things and the implications and the ramifications of it. But I think it's really important for us. There are, let me see here, 6 points that we're going to go over as far as accountability is concerned in our thoughts. The first, thoughts are real moral acts. Thought is an action of the spirit. Even when nothing is said or done outwardly, a thought reflects the spirit's moral state and intentions. Because of this, thoughts contribute to our spiritual progress or delay it. Have you ever thought about that? Your thoughts really do have an impact upon you. There is real moral value or detriment to our thoughts. So there is a moral responsibility that begins with intention and not only in action. Our intentions matter. It's in the Book of Mormon where, I believe it's in Moroni's discourse, that he says a gift given with a poor intention or spirit is better not to have been given at all. So your intention with how you approach things really matters. Now, in addition to just the mind aspect of it, the intention is also in the heart or in the emotional space. And this needs to be balanced with the mind or the intellectual space. So sometimes we get a little bit too top heavy in the intellectual side and the knowledge side. And sometimes, we sacrifice more of the emotional side. I would say sometimes the more emotional side might be that thought of, I really should call that person. It's those promptings and impressions that come through that maybe don't always make sense. Like your intellectual side might say, what was that about? But your heart might be speaking to you. So oftentimes that intention, if we can find this beautiful balance, it's us bringing together the heart and the mind in understanding just what our true intentions are, is a space that I think if we can align that, we'll be in a more a happier state. The second is intention, or the heart, matters more than appearance. A good deed done for selfish reasons has less moral value than a sincere good intention that couldn't be carried out. Likewise, harmful thoughts, such as hatred, envy, pride, or cruelty, still weigh on the spirit, even if they're never acted upon. Now, I did touch on that a little bit just earlier about the importance of good intention, but your thoughts, if you think hateful things, envious things, if you're being prideful, those have weight upon your soul. And so don't think that we can think something and not have it have implications in our spirit body. All of those thoughts, positive and negative, are going to impact your spirit body. Number 3, spirits are influenced by and attracted to your thoughts. Spiritism, this is from Allan Kardec, teaches that thoughts emit a kind of mental vibration. Elevated thoughts attract higher benevolent spirits. Negative or selfish thoughts attract lower troubled spirits. In essence, we're accountable not only for how thoughts shape us, but also for the influences we invite. And I think that just goes without saying. Our thoughts truly impact I'll call it the ethereal fluid of the universe. Our thoughts have vibrational resonance, and it will attract. It's that law of attraction, the law of vibration that we talked about in Hermeticism, that it truly does attract those things. Likes attract likes. And so elevate your thoughts to elevate not to elevate, but to attract good spirits. Number 4, accountability is proportional to awareness and effort. There's a balance between justice with mercy. We are not judged harshly or for fleeting or involuntary thoughts, but we are judged for thoughts that we entertain, nurture, or return to. So think about that. If something comes into our mind and I'm going to say we repent, right? We turn away from it, then those thoughts have much more mercy or leniency applied to them. But if we take a thought and we continue to linger upon it over and over and over again, and it tends to be something that is of a lower vibration, that will have more weight that we will be judged by. Justice will have more effect upon that when we continue in that thought. The next point here, our effort to improve, self-correct, and grow morally. So our thoughts have an effect on our effort to improve. It also has an effect on our progress, which is gradual, and sincere effort counts. My belief in an unconditionally loving God would suggest that God values every single effort that we make to be able to make good choices, have positive thoughts, and he's willing to give us every opportunity to continue to learn and progress and to offer that mercy that is there. But just know that your thoughts really do have an accountability to it. And the duration and the amount of effort that we put into those thoughts they truly do matter. Number 5, moral growth begins with inner reform. Because thoughts come before words and actions, Spiritism teaches that true moral improvement starts internally. Learning to recognize harmful thought patterns is important, replacing them with compassion, humility, and charity, and practicing self-knowledge and self-discipline. I think this is one of the beautiful things about I will call them enlightened masters that have walked upon this planet. Jesus Christ, one of the greatest things that he did was to help us to understand good morals, morality, and the consequences of our actions and our thoughts. His gospel is beautiful. It is amazing. And as complex as we want to make it, it really can be summed up oftentimes in those 2 great commandments, to love God and to love our neighbors as ourselves. Or we could add to that, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or do no harm to another person. Like, these are not super complicated concepts, but they do have very significant ramifications when we start to add them to the complexities of society. And so just think about that. The moral growth begins with inner reform. And so it's like, if you want to be able to remedy some of society's ills, we first have to work on the individual, on their moral compass. Because if we don't help them with their thoughts, then all of their outward expressions will not have positive manifestations. Number 6 is conscience, the inner guide to accountability. What is conscience? It is the voice of divine law within us. It alerts us when a thought is harmful or selfish. It encourages empathy, humility, and goodness. It grows clearer as the spirit evolves. When we ignore conscience repeatedly, it doesn't disappear. It becomes harder to hear. When we listen to it, it becomes stronger and more precise. And I think that's beautiful. Many of you who are students of the Book of Mormon will be super familiar with the phrase past feeling. This is in relationship to Laman and Lemuel and their father stating that maybe it was Nephi, stating that they were past feeling. And that's exactly what this is. We could call that the still small voice. We can call that the Spirit of God. We can call that a conscience. Whatever we want to call that, each of us has a divine, divining rod, right? Each of us has this divine rod that vibrates at a certain frequency. And the more that we listen to that and elevate our thoughts, the more in tune we can become to those frequencies and vibrations. And the less that we heed that conscience, the still small voice, the more difficult it will be for us to be able to heed that. There's one more point here. It says, this is why accountability is internal. There's no external judges needed. For example, we are our own judge, and the soul recognizes its own moral state through conscience. And I think that's really important. I've talked a lot about Matthew 7, where it talks about not being able to judge, or what judgment truly looks like. And the word judge or judgment, it's such a big word in churches, religions, and Christianity. And I'm still trying to come to understand it. But it's what I'm coming to understand about this idea of judgment is that our conscience is what we will be working with. And we will know perfectly where we are at and what we need to work through in order to overcome the lower vibration aspects of our spirit. So to recap accountability, in short, we are accountable for our thoughts because they reveal who we are becoming as spirits. But this accountability is always balanced by patience, education, and the opportunity to improve over time. So I mentioned something about this idea of remembering and how important it is to your identity and living beyond living beyond death, which brings in the concept of a veil. A lot of people within spiritual communities talk about this idea of a veil. And you could say, well, if there's this veil of forgetfulness, well, doesn't that throw a wrench into your thought experiment about, thought continuing on beyond death or not? Maybe God could just make us forget. I believe that the veil is important because we are multidimensional beings. That is who we are. And we're having this earthly experience. In order to have a very unique and tailored experience, we needed to have that veil of forgetfulness. And that is why we do not, many people, I'm not going to say all of us, but many people have this veil in place. And we are going through this life to have a very specific lesson that we wanted to get out of it. There are people who they do remember their past lives. They do remember many other things about the spirit world. And it's been helpful for me to be able to learn from those experiences to get a better understanding of maybe what I'm doing in this life. But it helps us to understand that we have a very unique human experience, and that is why that veil of forgetfulness is in place. Now, I couldn't end this essay without at least talking about mind control. Because if the mind offers us one of the greatest opportunities for progress and advancement, then that would mean that mind control is one of the greatest deceptions or one of the greatest forms of abuse that can be out there. And yes, it is real. Yes, it is happening, and it happens all over. I tell my kids this frequently, that behind all of these social media apps that they're scrolling on, that there's hundreds of engineers behind every one of those apps, and their entire focus is to get you to swipe and to click and to continue on that app. And it is designed to continue engagement. And not only that, but many of the stories and the news outlets and the media machine that is out there is intentionally crafted to manipulate your perception of reality. And so I think it can be good to have some awareness of the world around us, but just understand that what you see, if you're getting your news from the major stations and even the small ones, you're still getting a very impartial perception of the world. And they are trying and they're doing their damnedest to be able to control the narrative. I believe it's falling apart for them, but they're doing their best to be able to control that. There's a lot more that I could go into about what mind control is. There are very specific programs being run by very shady people, I'll just put it that way, that they do control people's minds. And so there might be people that you see out there in the news, and they have dissociated personalities, and they're acting as this one person, but someone has traumatized them enough to cause their personalities to split, and they do truly have the control of that person for a time. So just keep in mind that there is such power and beauty in the individuality that you have of crafting and being a creator, but to the contrary, those with evil intent are really trying to capture that power of creation that you have. So don't give that up. Don't give up your spiritual sovereignty, which is your ability to create spiritually. I mentioned in the beginning that I've been studying a little bit about Buddha, and I think I will wrap this up by mentioning one quote from him. He says, "It is important to discipline the mind. It is the mind that is the greatest enemy to the human being. It is the mind that is the greatest enemy to the individual, as it will create desires and wants and focus you to live in the external world instead of focusing on the internal direction of the human body. When you are able to focus on the internal, all of these activities or desires or these goals cause that their external world will no longer have a hold upon you. You can live your life in eternal joy and happiness, which is the pure definition of enlightenment. Struggle, pain, and suffering is not needed to discover the higher elements and lessons of actually holding joy within the brain, not just within the heart. It is allowing the two strongest elements of the human body, the heart and the mind, to communicate to a degree where there is no misunderstanding. So I'm kind of wrapping this up here towards the end. What I could go much further in, and in fact, volumes and volumes of books and podcasts and videos have been exploring this idea of how do we understand the spiritual creation within the mind. We could dive deep into the significance of meditation, and I believe meditation is far more, in fact, it's much more than just trying to clear the mind. I know that for many of us in a very hectic world, just clearing the mind in and of itself is an important, well, it's a feat in and of itself. But being able to come to an understanding of the mind, and understanding of who we are, and drawing upon, as I said, the mind and will of God, the ability for us to be able to access the universal mind, we can gain inspiration and revelation as to who we are and to what our worth is. And I believe we can attain what they, for example, Buddhism talks about nirvana. We can attain these celestial states as we focus on our thoughts and how that connects and ties in directly to our spirit and our heart and our mind. So thank you for joining me today. I hope some of that was helpful and at least caused you to think a little bit differently, maybe about your thoughts, the power that there is behind your thoughts, as well as the accountability behind your thoughts. So just want to let you guys know that I love you. I pray for you guys, and I wish you guys the best, and I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.